There's a sense of the Middle East having been in a state of turmoil for a very long time. And this is basically, I think, the image that many people have of what the Middle East is. But I think that's also misleading. I think that where we are right now in the Middle East is particularly upsetting for many people, certainly for people like me, because of how much has gone wrong. There was a time not too long ago when we actually had hope that the region might be changing in a positive direction. The prospect of genuine democratic change in the region. And it's easy to forget how enthusiastic people were, not just here in the United States, but in the region about what was happening. This was a time when you had seen the overthrow of several of the longest-serving, longest-ruling leaders, and in many cases, some of the most repressive leaders in the Middle East being overthrown by peaceful popular revolutions. To see people like Ben Ali of Tunisia, Mubarak of Egypt, or Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen being brought down through popular mobilization, and then to see people trying to figure out ways to create new political institutions, to build parliaments, to hold elections. This was genuinely something new, and this was a moment of absolute revolutionary fever in the region. If you go back to the first half of 2011, it's just very difficult to remember, to recall that feeling now, given what we know. This feeling of not just that change was possible, but a really profound, deep conviction among almost everybody that I talked to in the region that change was inevitable, that basically what we were seeing was this rising tide of popular mobilization, the aspirations of these new youth movements that were going to basically force the region into something new, and that there was no going back. And nobody really thought it was going to be easy, but I think that you don't want to forget just this wave of revolutionary enthusiasm, and it was contagious across the entire region. At the time, it was common to turn on Al Jazeera, a pan-Arab television station, and you would be able to see like a split-screen TV, and they would be showing people protesting, marching down the streets in 6 different Arab countries simultaneously. All of them chanting the same slogans, all of them asking for the same things, and just caught up, and then often like watching Al Jazeera on their phones as they're doing this, and you get in this endless recursive loop of feeling like you're part of a moment, feeling like you're a part of a moment where a story is playing out, and yeah, things could always go wrong, but you didn't feel like they were going to go wrong. And there was this moment. And it's that hope, that sense of opportunity that makes where we are now so crushing. Because in a sense, everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong. I mean, not everything. There's probably going to be plenty more to come, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But certainly, almost every place where we had real meaningful hope, we now, it's just in tatters. Egypt, where we thought we might have a real democratic transition with the first real example of the inclusion of a moderate Islamist movement, it's been absolutely shattered by a military coup and the reinstallation of fierce repression, which is worse than anything we saw under the previous old regime. In Libya, where the United States led an international intervention to rescue the country from a civil war and the rule of Muammar Gaddafi, you've seen almost complete state failure and the emergence of a basically state collapse and civil war, which is dragging down its neighbors, both Egypt and Tunisia, and into Africa. In Yemen, where people placed great hope in this excruciatingly negotiated, United Nations-led transition process, trying to have a national dialogue and bring together a roadmap for a democratic transition in Yemen. Just a few days ago, the capital city was overrun by rebels from the provinces, and the president has fled. And one more possible success story has been ripped away from us. We have Tunisia. We'll always have Tunisia, I hope. But that's a very slim reed on which to hang the hopes of the entire region. To understand the outbreak of the Arab uprisings back in 2011, you have to see it as part of a long process. It didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It's not just that some kids woke up one morning and decided that they were going to overthrow Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and camp out in Tahrir Square until he left. There was a very long process that got us to that point, and it actually gives you some very useful perspective if you think about it in those terms. So what I mean is that, you could start anywhere. You could go back to the Ottoman Empire if you wanted to, but I'm going to start basically about a decade before the uprisings break out. And basically what you see is over the period of a decade leading up to 2011, you see this really clear and really alarming collapse, or not collapse is the wrong word, let's just say the degradation of, or the decay of institutions across the region, of increasing gaps between rich and poor, increasing struggles of ordinary people to make ends meet, and increasing failures of government. Where what happens in capital cities, what happens in national parliaments, seemed ever more irrelevant to what was happening in the daily lives of people. On paper, if you look at like IMF reports or World Bank reports, Egypt or Tunisia actually look like success stories in the 2000s. GDP is growing quickly, people seem to be getting rich, you see the emergence of a new class of entrepreneurs who are competitive on international markets and international banking, international finance. But what was happening was that this new class was, in a sense, separating from the rest of society. A few people were getting really rich, and a lot of people were falling farther and farther behind. I would go and I would be driving with friends of mine who were, say, Jordanian university professors, solidly middle to upper middle class, who were telling me that they couldn't afford to buy food for their families and heat their houses. You would go to Egypt and you would see bridges collapsing, apartment buildings falling down, ferries capsizing, trains jumping the rails, and in one memorable moment, the parliament burned to the ground and no one even noticed. So basically what you saw over the entire period leading up to the Arab uprisings was a long, grinding process of institutional, political, economic decay. There's a widespread sense for years that these political systems were failing. This didn't surprise anybody. There was enormous levels of discontent, and increasingly, thanks to satellite television, thanks to the internet, thanks to the increasing information technology, increasing awareness of what was going on. All those newly wealthy people driving around Amman or Cairo in their fancy new Western cars, this only confirmed what people knew from their daily lives, that they were being left behind and that these people who were probably corrupt were benefiting in ways that they weren't. And there was enormous pent-up rage. And you were seeing it play out in the streets. So I think a lot of us, when we saw the protests breaking out in Cairo in January 25th, 2011, a lot of people thought that this was like in East Germany in 1989, out of nowhere, big surprise. No one has ever protested before, and now suddenly they're protesting. It couldn't be further from the truth. In Egypt, you have been having protests rising and rising and rising for a decade. By the time you get to 2011, there was hardly a sector of Egyptian society that hadn't been out in the streets protesting at one point or another. A few years before 2011, an entire industrial city was shut down by a massive industrial strike. Judges were protesting, journalists were protesting, lawyers were protesting, students were on strike. This was a dynamic society with enormous levels of mobilization and yet utter stagnation at the top. Just before the Arab Spring broke out, Egypt held parliamentary elections. They basically prevented any of their opponents from running. They manipulated and gerrymandered all the results, and the National Democratic Party won something like 95% of the seats. Nobody cared, because this was so far, they didn't need Western political scientists to come tell them that they had undemocratic institutions. They lived in them. They knew. So this was rising up. Meanwhile, you have a whole bunch of other things going on. Remember, this is the era of the war on Iraq, which absolutely shattered and destroyed one of the most powerful states in the region and led to this enormous explosion of anti-Americanism, of sectarianism, of violent conflict and extremism. If you're looking for the roots of ISIS and you're looking for where did this extraordinarily radical group come from, where it comes from is the Iraq War. and from the evolution of al-Qaeda in Iraq and how that metastasized within an insurgency that raged for years. This was the era of the global war on terror. This was the era of globalization. All kinds of things are going on in this period, and all of them increasingly point to one basic thing: profound dissatisfaction among an increasingly mobilized population, combined with leaders who just didn't get it. Leaders who thought that because they had always weathered every crisis in the past, would weather this crisis as well. So the surprise in January 2011 was not that the Egyptians went out in the streets and protested, it's that they won. Because they never won. They always protested and they always lost. And when they won, when Ben Ali got on an airplane and fled to Saudi Arabia, when Hosni Mubarak was removed from power by the military, that introduced hope, the possibility of change, and that is a very, very powerful thing. And not just in their countries, across the entire region, arguably in the entire world. I still remember my wacky Egyptian friends sending pizzas to the protesters in Madison, Wisconsin, saying, here's a gift from Tahrir Square. I'm glad you've learned from us, right? I mean, there's this notion of this idea that mobilization can work. But then, of course, it didn't work. And that gets us to the second part of this, because what you see after that dizzying early Arab Spring is the complete and total failure of all of those efforts to bring about positive change. And this unfolds sequentially in various places. So across the Gulf, for example, you see a pretty brutal crackdown on the mobilization in the tiny little kingdom of Bahrain. At the peak of its mobilization, more than 50% of the citizens of Bahrain were in the streets protesting and demanding democratic change. And they were swept from the streets, arrested, tortured, and subject to unbelievable levels of repression, which then became the first example of a highly mobilized Arab population that was repressed successfully. And that put a dent in the hopes. Yemeni protests turned into an armed standoff between different armed factions. Libya descended into a civil war, military intervention from the West. Basically, you end up with a situation where country after country, that dizzying hope gives way to the long grind of ordinary politics. Our friend from Morocco is here, and the King of Morocco was one of the only leaders who actually got out ahead of things and offered genuine constitutional reforms. A lot of activists were upset that they didn't go far enough, but the reality is that Morocco was one of the only countries in the entire Arab world that put their finger to the wind, saw this mobilization, and actually took proactive political steps to try and meet the demands of their people. And whether or not that's worked, we can talk about, but I think it's quite interesting that that's one of the only countries that actually did make those efforts. But across the board, then, you see this enormous rise of optimism followed by this rapid crash. And if you look at the core countries, this crash takes different forms. So Egypt, a country that has always been one of the bellwethers of the Middle East, the largest country in the Middle East, cultural, intellectual leader, and the driving force of the Arab Spring, you go through this incredibly difficult, tortuous process of transition. They attempt to negotiate a new parliament, a new constitution. They have elections, nobody's happy with the elections, they dissolve the parliament, they have new elections to the presidency, nobody's happy with the outcome. I could bore you all day talking about what happened in Egypt, but the way it ends, as I said, is in a military coup and the criminalization of the former party which had come to power through elections and the imposition of sweeping repression and control of the political sphere, but, and here's the difference, with the enthusiastic support of significant portions of the population. When Hosni Mubarak was putting people in jail, nobody cheered him on. But now you have this youth, you have these people who not so long ago I thought were the absolute barrier to a return to authoritarian rule, cheering it on happily. And that's a big change. That's a pretty shocking change. And then all the litany of woes that I gave a minute ago from Yemen to Libya and beyond. So why did it happen? I would pinpoint a couple of things that you might want to look at as you try and make sense of it. And none of them are Arabs aren't ready for democracy, Arabs don't want democracy, or anything like that. What I would focus on is, number one, these uprisings proved to be very good at destroying things, at pulling things down, but they were never able to come up with alternatives. They were never able to put in place better institutions. And so the Libyan state, which was a horrible state, was brought down. But then they took forever to come up with a new constitution. They didn't disarm the militias. They were unable to reestablish a better state, one that could provide security, economic wealth, or opportunities in life. They just couldn't do it. Egypt couldn't do it. Yemen couldn't do it. The new institutions didn't replace the old. But then, number two, all of the problems that caused the uprisings in the first place got worse. So it's not that people became satisfied, they got angrier, they got more alienated, more frustrated. If you're an Egyptian, you were already living through tough times. Now you've had a collapse of security on the streets, you've had complete failure of all of your political leaders, you've had tourism collapse, you've had foreign investment collapse, you've basically had almost everything get worse. So what does that do to you? It was something that you once firmly, fervently, passionately believed in, turned out to not meet any of your needs. Think about what that does psychologically. Failure to find new alternatives and institutions, failure to deliver. There's also some other things that went on. There's proxy wars. All of those states that were weak became a playing field for the more powerful and more stable states in the region. And so what's happening in Egypt stops being just about Egypt. Now you have Qatar and United Arab Emirates fighting their little battles out by supporting local actors on the ground, funneling money and guns to the groups that they want to support, and it becomes penetrated more and more by foreign powers. Libya becomes a place where you have proxy wars unfolding between all these groups. Yemen has always been that. It became it even more so. These proxy wars, I think, were very, very negative for the consolidation of new democratic institutions. And then, of course, you have what I've been holding off until now, because I know it's what most of you want to hear about, and now I'm going to get to it. You have Syria. And what happened in Syria is, in my opinion, one of the worst humanitarian and political catastrophes of the 21st century. That's not saying much, it's only 14 years, but I would say for a very, very long time. And Syria, in a sense, brings together all of the things that I'm talking about, but in ways that turn it into this genuine, there's a metaphor that I keep thinking of, is that it's a black hole. It's like a vortex dragging everything else down into its wake. So, Syria. Syria begins, like most of the Arab uprisings, with small popular mobilization, and they're using the same slogans, they're using the same repertoires, they seem to be asking for the same things. In February, March of 2011, they look not dissimilar to an Egypt or a Tunisia or a Yemen. You have similar types of people doing similar kinds of things and asking for similar kinds of changes. But the difference is that in Syria, Bashar al-Assad's regime responded very quickly with really quite bloody and brutal military force. To that point, there were only two other countries that had done the same: Bahrain, which got away with it, and Libya, which did not. Libya, when Muammar Gaddafi did the same basic thing, was met with an international intervention, UN Security Council resolutions, a NATO bombing campaign, and basically an entire international coalition focused on making it impossible for him to shoot his way to stay in power through military force. Some people think that Bashar looked at that, and the lesson that he drew was, I don't want things to get started, because I don't want that to happen to me. Others draw different lessons. I don't think we'll really know for quite some time. But what we do know is that Bashar, in a sense, brought things onto himself, because what began as quite small civic mobilizations, nonviolent protests, escalated very quickly once he started killing people. You know, so you start like grabbing people off the streets and shooting them in the head and throwing them on their front porch. Well, now you've not just killed someone, you've made an enemy of that person's family, that person's tribe, that person's clan, that person's village, and basically it set in motion a cycle. Protests had been very small, they began to grow. And the more they grew, the more they were met with enormous violent force. And the violence which was being used by the regime almost exclusively against the protesters in most of 2011 was really astonishing. When President Obama said that Assad must go, that he's lost his legitimacy and he must step down, many people took that as like an imperative statement. Bashar, you must go. I actually think he meant it more as a descriptive statement. No president who has done such things could possibly be legitimate ever again. Once you've bombarded one of your own cities and murdered thousands of your own people, how can you ever claim to represent your people again? And I think that this was, at that time, a fairly morally clear situation. It didn't remain so for long. As Bashar continued to attack his people and to repress these protesters with force, more and more of them decided to take up arms. And what began as a civic uprising against a brutal dictator began morphing quickly into an insurgency. There was a balance back and forth for a long time, about 6 months or so, when it wasn't clear which direction it was going to go. But by early 2012, it had unmistakably shifted from a peaceful uprising into an insurgency, and increasingly an insurgency which was being fueled by the provision of weapons and guns from the outside, from Turkey, from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from private donors in the Gulf. And as these guns and money poured into the country, Iran responded and Hezbollah responded, and Syria transforms into a proxy war between all these different competing forces in the region. The Syrian people then become the victims of this, creating one of the most unbelievable human disasters that really the world has witnessed. Right now, there are, the counts, you'll read this in the newspaper, you'll say that 200,000 people are dead. Nobody really knows. I mean, this is a war zone with almost no journalists on the ground. Could be 100,000, could be 1 million. We don't really know. What we do know is that there's over 3 million registered refugees outside of the country, out of a population that started around 28 million, and 10 million registered internally displaced, more than a third of the population. What we do know is that this then became the epicenter of this regional proxy war, and it became increasingly radicalized, increasingly sectarianized, and increasingly simply a failed state in which these forces were fighting their battles in very much a local level. So people often ask, they say, well, doesn't this mean that the US should have gotten involved earlier, that it should have acted to try and stop all of this? The problem was that there was never really very much that the United States could have done. The rebels that were fighting were never the kind of disciplined, organized movement that the United States could have supported. And even if they had, and they had somehow morphed into this moderate Syrian rebel army that people talk about, nobody really believes that they would have been able to bring down Bashar, or that if they had, they would have been able to stabilize the country which follows. I'm sure that people have questions about this, so I'll kind of leave it and we'll come back and pick this up. But the key point that I want to make is that the US, we're Americans, so we tend to argue a lot about what America should or shouldn't do, but America wasn't the driver here. What was happening was that this state essentially ceased to exist, was ripped apart, and became an arena for proxy wars from around the region, with Hezbollah and Iran directly intervening and their adversaries indirectly intervening, and at the expense of the people. Now, this then becomes, as I said, a black hole, a vortex dragging everything down. Jordan, I was talking to the Jordanian foreign minister about 6 months ago, and he told me that the Zaatari refugee camp was now the 3rd largest city in Jordan. The number of refugees in Lebanon is, depending on how you count, more than 25% of the population. Southern Turkey has become almost exclusively Syrian zone at this point. Now, some of those countries will be fine, they can handle it, others can't, but it's really hard to imagine how a country like Jordan or a country like Lebanon can continue to be resilient forever when hosting that number of refugees, facing those urgent needs, and still directly personally involved in an unfolding war. But the greatest example, and the one that I think probably brings a lot of you here, is what it does to Iraq. In Iraq, basically, you had the legacies, the remnants of the civil war and insurgency which the US had been fighting and then left in 2011, but never really ended. Even during the peace of relative calm and relative security, you still had dozens of attacks a day, hundreds of people being killed a day, and this was escalating all through 2011, through 2012. But by 2013, roughly a year before most people started paying attention, you began to see this really intense interaction between the Iraqi insurgency and what becomes ISIS, the Syrian, the most extreme version of the Syrian jihadist insurgency. They basically fuse, they move back and forth across the border with impunity, and they basically provide each other strategic depth. And you begin to see this rising insurgency campaign in Iraq and the increasing advances of ISIS inside of Syria. Now, this is all unfolding, and people aren't paying that much attention to it because Americans don't pay attention to Iraq anymore because we left. And Syria was just so confusing and so horrible that people weren't really paying attention to the details. Suddenly, we start paying attention when ISIS forces suddenly surge through Iraq, seize Mosul, and are marching towards Erbil, and seem to even be marching towards Baghdad. Now, I think this is actually a bit exaggerated. I think that the collapse of the Iraqi army took everyone by surprise and has a lot to do with the failure to hold Mosul. I think that ISIS gains enormous strength from its alliances with non-jihadist actors who are just upset and frustrated with the Maliki government. There's a whole bunch of things happening in Iraq. But they managed to capture huge numbers of American weapons, get huge amounts of money, and get control of a very significant amount of territory, which they then bring back into Syria and are able then to use against their enemies, not just Bashar al-Assad, but also against all of the other Syrian rebel groups. Now, even that might have not drawn any real international attention had they not made the decision to execute 2 Americans on video. And I'm sure everybody here is aware of or has seen the beheadings of Jim Foley and Steve Sotloff. I think that image, more than anything else, explains why we are now involved in bombing campaigns in Syria and bombing plus advising missions in Iraq. Whether that's a good way to make such a decision or not, we can talk about, leave it up to you. But the fact is that now, we've started bombing in Syria. And, once you start something like that, it's very difficult to stop because I don't know anybody who believes that air power is going to destroy ISIS, bring down Bashar, or fundamentally change the game in Syria. Thus far, what it's mostly managed to do is unite the entire Syrian opposition against the United States because they're all furious that we're attacking ISIS instead of attacking Bashar. But basically, we are now heading down that slippery slope, and what this means is that we don't know where we're going to end up. My personal takeaway from a decade in Iraq is that even if we do go all in and put 150,000 troops on the ground, we're still not going to be able to solve the problem, and that we're now staring into that abyss. It also means that as we now become a nation at war once again, almost everything else is going to become secondary. So no more talking about democracy, no more talking about uprisings, no more talking about economic reform, because those things are all going to interfere with the mission of counterterrorism and of going into Syria. And I think that, in a sense, the real tragedy of where we are right now is that this was precisely the Middle East that President Obama had hoped to leave behind And in many ways, he was elected to leave behind, and now he's been dragged back into it, and yet there doesn't seem to be anything which we can constructively do about it. For the people in the region, their hopes have been dashed, their fears are high, and the possibility of meaningful, peaceful change seems to have largely been ripped away from them. And so traditionally, when I would give talks on this subject in the past, I would now pivot to, and yet there's reason for optimism. There's still reason for hope. And I can show you, my notes here where it says opportunity, and really nothing comes after that, because I just have a big question mark. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't really find any reason for optimism right now. If anybody would like to provide one, I'd be very, very happy to hear it. The only one that I can come up with is the one that I started with, which is that this is just the beginning of a very long process. The Arab uprisings were something that happened 10 years into a 50-year-long process, and that right now we're in the darkest moment, but perhaps that simply means that now is the time for the narrative to shift and for us to now start seeing rays of hope appear. It's a slim hope, but it's almost the only one that I can come up with. I do think that some of the changes, the positive changes, are irreversible. Arabs are still young. They're more connected to the world than they ever were before. They're wired into the internet. They have aspirations and hopes, and if I do want to leave you with a ray of hope, it would be that eventually they're going to be rejecting what's happening now, just as they rejected the autocracy of before. But the reason that I can't give you too much hope from that is because everything they've tried to do with that hope has failed. And I think that that's where we are in this very dismal and dim moment in the Middle East right now. I realize that's a terrible place to end a talk, but nevertheless I will.